Across a world steeped in blood and ancient secrets, an eerie tale unfolds, echoing through the dark, Gothic streets. Tonight, we journey through the intricate lore of Bloodborne, from the forgotten whispers of ancient civilizations to the tragic, endless hunt of the present. Welcome to Games Lore to Sleep, where we dive into haunting stories from distant realms. If you enjoy these long, winding tales through the twisted corners of your favorite universes, be sure to follow the channel and join me for more bedtime adventures. Now, close your eyes, take a steady breath, and let the haunting tale of Bloodborne wash over you as we unravel the tragic history of this cursed world. Long before the city of Yharnam existed, before the healing church rose to power, there was a forgotten civilization, one that would shape the very fabric of Bloodborne's story. This civilization, Yharnam, was nestled deep within the earth, far from the sunlight that bathed the surface. It was a place of shadows, a civilization built beneath the world, in the dark recesses of vast labyrinthine tunnels that would later become known as the Chalice Dungeons. The Yharnamians were not like the humans who would come after them, taller, more gaunt, with skin so pale it appeared as though it had never known the warmth of the sun. Their architecture was a marvel, grand yet terrifying, built to honor the unknown and the unseen, with intricate designs that would forever echo through the ages. But their greatest achievement wasn't their vast underground city or the wonders they created. It was their discovery, a discovery that would change the course of their civilization and, ultimately, humanity itself. Deep beneath the earth, the Yharnamians encountered beings that existed on a plane beyond human comprehension. They found the Great Ones, entities of cosmic significance, whose existence spanned realms beyond the mortal world. These beings were not gods in the traditional sense. They did not demand worship, nor did they offer salvation in the way humans would understand. They simply were ancient, eternal, and incomprehensible. The Yharnamians, in their search for knowledge, made contact with these Great Ones. But this was no simple exchange of knowledge. It was a communion, a bond forged in blood. The Yharnamians began to harness the power of the Great Ones, learning their secrets and unlocking the potential of their blood, a blood infused with the essence of the Great Ones themselves. This blood had miraculous properties. It could heal wounds, cure diseases, extend life, and grant power beyond mortal limits. For the Yharnamians, it was the key to transcending their humanity, to reaching a state of being that was beyond what they had ever known. But as with all things that promise power, there was a price. The blood of the Great Ones, while capable of granting great gifts, also carried a curse. Those who consumed it began to change. Some ascended, becoming something greater than human, beings of beauty and power. But for many, the blood twisted them, transforming them into monstrous creatures, their humanity slipping away as they were consumed by the power they had sought to control. These first transformations planted the seeds of what would later be known as the scourge of beasts. The Great Ones themselves were not without their own desires. Though they were beyond human understanding, one thing seemed certain: they longed for children. It is this desire that becomes the central tragedy of Bloodborne. The Great Ones could not reproduce in the way humans did. Instead, they sought surrogate offspring, and the Yharnamians, in their desperation to ascend, began to provide that which the Great Ones craved. The Great Ones' yearning for children would become the driving force behind much of the tragedy in Bloodborne's lore. As the Yharnamians delved deeper into the rituals surrounding the blood, they began to change in ways that were not entirely predictable. Some ascended to godlike beings, while others descended into monstrous bestial forms. The very first seeds of the beast scourge were sown in these ancient times as the blood of the Great Ones began to take its toll. What was once a civilization of profound knowledge and power began to unravel as the consequences of their communion with the Great Ones became clear. Those who were not transformed into beasts became consumed by madness, driven by an insatiable hunger for more of the Great One's blood. In the end, the Thumerian civilization fell, leaving behind only their ruins and the terrifying labyrinths they had created. The Chalice Dungeons, once sacred spaces of knowledge and power, became tombs guarded by the undead and filled with the remnants of a civilization that had reached too far. The Thumerians, in their ambition to transcend, had doomed themselves, and as their cities crumbled, their legacy would be forgotten, buried deep beneath the earth, awaiting rediscovery by those who would come after them. But the Thumerians did not leave their secrets behind entirely. The chalices, those sacred cups used in their rituals, remained. These artifacts, imbued with the power of the Great One's blood, would eventually be discovered by others, scholars, adventurers, and of course the healing church. The knowledge contained within these chalices would serve as the foundation for the future tragedy of Bloodborne. Humanity, it seems, is destined to repeat the mistakes of those who came before. The healing church, centuries after the fall of Chumaru, would discover the old blood and seek to harness it for themselves. They would follow in the footsteps of the Thumerians, believing they could control the power of the Great Ones without suffering the same fate. But as we know, history has a way of repeating itself. The Thumerians' ambition to transcend had cost them everything, and the healing church would pay the same price. The legacy of Thumeru, with its grand architecture, ancient knowledge, and transformative blood, would live on, not in the form of monuments or written records, but in the very blood of those who sought to wield its power. The Thumerians, in their quest for ascension, had set in motion a tragedy that would haunt the world of Bloodborne for centuries to come. As the centuries passed and the memory of the ancient Thumerian civilization faded into legend, a new city began to rise. Yharnam, built atop the ruins of the forgotten civilization. Yharnam was a city of both beauty and mystery, a place of sprawling streets lit by gas lamps and Gothic spires that seemed to pierce the sky. It was a city where the old and the new coexisted, a place where the legacy of Thumeru was buried beneath the surface, but not forgotten. And in this city, a new power would rise, one that would harness the power of the Great One's blood, the healing church. The healing church was founded on the belief that blood could heal. This seemingly simple premise would drive the church to rise to unparalleled power. At first, their practices were seen as miraculous, with the promise of healing for the sick, the weak, and the dying. Through blood ministration, the church could cure diseases, mend broken bodies, and offer hope to the hopeless. The people of Yharnam flocked to the church, drawn by the promise of salvation, unaware of the dark forces at play beneath the surface. But behind the miracles, there was more than just healing. The church's leaders, particularly a man named Lawrence, had their sights set on a far more ambitious goal: transcendence. Lawrence, a brilliant but ambitious scholar, had long studied the ancient texts and remnants of Thumeru. He knew that the blood the Thumerians had discovered was more than just a cure. It was a gateway. It was a means to ascend beyond human limitations and reach a higher plane of existence, to become something more than mortal. Lawrence and his fellow scholars at the church had uncovered the ancient rituals that the Thumerians had used to commune with the Great Ones. They found the blood that infused the Great Ones themselves, the very essence of these cosmic beings. And as they studied it further, they realized that this blood held the power to change everything. It could heal, yes, but it could also grant power, immense, unimaginable power. It was the key to achieving the kind of transcendence that Lawrence had long dreamed of. But in their thirst for knowledge, the Church's leaders overlooked the warnings that came with it. The blood of the Great Ones was not a gift, it was a curse. The very same blood that could heal could also corrupt. Those who received the blood began to change. At first the changes were subtle, an increase in strength, vitality and longevity. But as time went on, the effects grew more pronounced, more dangerous. The Church's experiments with blood began to show signs of something darker, transformations that twisted the human form into something monstrous. It started slowly, with a few isolated cases, patients who had received too much blood or the wrong kind. They began to exhibit strange behaviors, becoming more aggressive, more unpredictable. But soon the transformations became more severe. Some of the afflicted began to change physically, their bodies warping into grotesque animalistic forms. They became what would later be known as beasts. But even as these monstrous creatures appeared, the Healing Church refused to stop their experiments. Instead, they chose to manage the situation. They continued their blood ministration practices, convincing the public that the benefits far outweighed the risks. They labeled the beasts as victims of a plague, an unfortunate side effect of the blood's power, and assured the people of Yharnam that the Church had everything under control. The Church, with its immense influence, even began to justify its actions. They argued that the old blood was the key to humanity's evolution, that it was a necessary step in the pursuit of greater power and understanding. They viewed the transformation of the afflicted not as a tragedy, but as an unfortunate but necessary cost on the road to ascension. As the number of afflicted individuals grew, the Church's power expanded with it. They became the ultimate authority in Yharnam, controlling not only the practice of medicine, but also the city's politics, its spiritual life, and even its laws. They set up churches and cathedrals, and their influence spread to every corner of the city. They established the Healing Church Hunters, a specialized order of warriors tasked with hunting down the beasts and protecting the Church's secrets. The hunters were given the finest weapons, armor and training. They were the Church's enforcers, ensuring that the city's darkness was kept at bay, even as they hid the true nature of their work from the masses. But despite their best efforts to maintain control, the Church's actions were beginning to catch up with them. The transformation into beasts wasn't something that could be easily contained. As the blood continued to spread, more and more people began to show signs of transformation. Entire families, once healthy and happy, began to succumb to the scourge, and as the beasts grew in number, so did the Church's desperation. They knew that the public couldn't be kept in the dark forever. The truth would eventually come out. It was in this atmosphere of fear and secrecy that the Church began to make its most questionable decisions. They started using more extreme measures to control the spread of the beasts. Entire districts were quarantined and burned to the ground, with the Church justifying these actions as necessary for the greater good. Old Yharnam, once a thriving district, was decimated by fire. Its streets turned to ash as the Church took drastic steps to contain the outbreak. The decision to burn the district became a turning point for the Church, a decision that would haunt them for years to come. The Church's hypocrisy became more apparent with each passing day. While they continued to offer blood ministration to the public, they also began to hunt down those who had been transformed into beasts. They carried out the hunts with brutal efficiency, killing any beast they encountered, but all the while hiding the true nature of the blood from the people. The church had created this plague, and yet they stood as the sole authority on how to deal with it. They were both the creators and the saviors, a position that gave them immense power over the lives of Yharnam's citizens. The darker side of the healing church's influence was the growing sense of fear and paranoia that began to spread throughout the city. As the beasts multiplied, so did the hunters, and the once glorious city of Yharnam became a battleground between those who sought to control the old blood and those who sought to escape its influence. The healing church's leaders knew that their actions could not be undone. They had unleashed something that couldn't be controlled, something that had become far greater than they could ever imagine. And yet, despite all of this, the church continued their practices, driven by their obsession with power and transcendence. The church's ultimate goal was clear. They sought to ascend to a higher plane, to transcend the limitations of humanity and unlock the secrets of the cosmos. But as they reached for the heavens, they pulled the entire city into their madness. And so Yharnam, once a city of promise and hope, became a place of suffering and despair, a city caught in the grip of an ancient curse that could never be undone. The healing church, once a beacon of salvation, was now a symbol of humanity's greatest folly, the pursuit of power at any cost. And as the city descended into madness, the hunters of Yharnam, those brave souls who took to the streets to fight the beasts, became the only ones who could stand against the tide of darkness. But even they could not escape the church's influence, for they too were bound by the same blood that had brought the city to ruin. The transformation of Yharnam from a city of healing into a city of monsters didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, creeping descent, a steady, undeniable unraveling. Initially, the cases were isolated, individuals whose bodies and minds began to twist under the influence of the old blood. Some of these early transformations were so subtle that the people of Yharnam were unaware of what was happening. But as the blood continued to spread, so did the changes. It was during this early period that the healing church, with its vast resources, still believed they had control over the situation. The first instances of the beast transformation were dismissed as rare side effects, anomalies that could be contained and dealt with swiftly. But as more and more people began showing symptoms, the church could no longer hide the truth. The same blood that had once been hailed as a miracle cure was now a poison, spreading madness, mutation, and death. The first signs of the scourge appeared in the form of subtle but unsettling behavioral changes. People became more violent, more aggressive. They began to experience fits of rage, hallucinations, and strange cravings. The church dismissed these as the result of hysteria or the pressure of the times. But as the affliction spread, the symptoms grew more pronounced. The first beasts emerged, people whose bodies had become twisted, their limbs contorted into grotesque shapes, their eyes wide and feral. At first, the healing church's response was one of containment. Those who were afflicted by the blood were quarantined and removed from the public eye. The church made efforts to keep the populace calm, assuring them that everything was under control. But the problem had become too large, too widespread to hide for long. As more and more people began to fall victim to the transformation, panic spread throughout the city. The once peaceful streets of Yharnam became a breeding ground for terror. At the heart of the problem was the blood itself. The old blood, once believed to be the key to healing, now seemed like a curse. The healing church had long believed that through blood they could transcend human limitations. But in their pursuit of power, they had ignored the true nature of the blood's effects. The very substance that had brought them glory now transformed them into monsters. their own creations turning on them in terrifying ways. With each new transformation, the distinction between man and beast became more blurred. The beasts were not mere animals, nor were they mindless. They were still human, at least in part, driven by their former memories, emotions, and desires. But those remnants of humanity became twisted by the primal instincts that the blood awakened. What had once been a noble people, driven by ambition and a desire to transcend, had become something much darker. The blood didn't just transform their bodies, it shattered their minds, and in doing so, it set the stage for an entire society to crumble. The beasts grew in number, and with them the fear and confusion that gripped the city. The healing church, once the epitome of order and control, was now helpless to stop the flood of madness that had been unleashed. The church, unable to admit that their practices had caused this plague, resorted to more extreme measures. Instead of halting their experiments, they doubled down, convinced that they could still control the blood. But every attempt only seemed to worsen the situation. As the beasts grew in power and number, so did the hunters. But the hunters, too, were affected by the blood they wielded. The healing church had created the hunters to protect Yharnam from the beasts, but in doing so, they had given them the very tools that could turn them into the very thing they were hunting. The hunters were bound to the blood, just as the people of Yharnam were bound to the curse. There was no escape from it. The hunters could kill the beasts, but they could not escape the fact that they too were subject to the blood's curse. Some hunters, in their bloodlust, began to lose themselves to the very madness they had been tasked with stopping. They became blood drunk, intoxicated by the thrill of the hunt and the power that came with the blood. The line between hunter and beast began to blur. As the scourge spread, the city of Yharnam descended into chaos. The once proud city, known for its beauty and grandeur, was now a city of nightmares. The streets were filled with beasts, both human and animal, roaming the city in a twisted parody of life. The healing church's attempts to manage the situation only made things worse. They established the hunt, a ritualized extermination of the beasts, but this only perpetuated the cycle of violence. The hunt became a ritual, not for the protection of the city, but for the perpetuation of the church's power. The hunters were not saving the city, they were serving the interests of the church. The church's response to the growing scourge was to establish stricter control over the people of Yharnam. The hunts were officially sanctioned, and the hunters were given the right to hunt down and kill anyone suspected of being afflicted by the beast scourge. Citizens were told to lock themselves inside their homes at night, to pray, and to trust that the hunters would keep them safe. But the church's actions were far from selfless. The hunts were not about saving the people of Yharnam, they were about maintaining control over the city. The church had created this crisis, and now they were using it to solidify their power. In this atmosphere of fear, the people of Yharnam were left with few options. The beast scourge spread like a disease, and the hunters, once seen as heroes, were now just another part of the system that perpetuated the city's suffering. The people were trapped. They could not escape the hunt, nor could they escape the blood that had caused it all. The church's power grew, and the blood continued to flow. The people of Yharnam were left to suffer, with no way to stop the cycle that had been set in motion. But the church, for all its power, could not escape the inevitable. The beast scourge was not something that could be controlled. It was a disease of the soul, a punishment for the sins of the healing church. The blood that had been used to heal had now become the source of their downfall. And as the city of Yharnam descended further into madness, The true cost of the Healing Church's ambition became clear. They had sought to transcend humanity, but in doing so they had condemned themselves to an eternity of suffering, a cycle of violence and bloodshed that could never be broken. While the city of Yharnam burned with the horrors of the beast's scourge, a darker, more sinister force was at work within its walls, one that had risen from the very heart of the Healing Church. As the beasts roamed freely and the city descended into madness, the most powerful and elite members of the church withdrew into the upper cathedral ward, beyond the reach of the common folk. Here, high above the suffering streets, the choir had begun its own search for transcendence, one that would lead them down a path darker than even the worst of the beast transformations. The choir, composed of the church's intellectual and spiritual elite, believed that ascension could be achieved through communion with the Great Ones, not through the crude use of blood ministration, but through spiritual insight and cosmic communion. They were not interested in the simple, violent transformations that plagued the common people. They believed the path to divinity was one of purity and enlightenment. They wanted to transcend the mortal form, to escape the very limitations of human flesh, and to gain insight into the truths of the cosmos that the Church had long sought to understand. But the path they chose was no less horrific than the blood-soaked rituals of the Healing Church below. The choir's members, led by the high-ranking clergy and scholars, began experimenting with the very essence of the Great Ones themselves. They sought to commune with the beings of the cosmos, attempting to unlock the true nature of their power. And to achieve this, they turned to the most innocent of subjects, children. The Church, in its unyielding pursuit of knowledge, established an orphanage under the guise of charity. Officially, it was a place of refuge for children who had been orphaned by the scourge, a sanctuary for those whose families had been torn apart by the horrors of Yharnam. But in truth, the orphanage served a far darker purpose. The choir needed subjects, young, pliable minds to experiment on, to expose to the cosmic horrors they had begun to study. The children, already traumatized by the loss of their parents, became the perfect vessels for the choir's twisted experiments. At first, the rituals performed at the orphanage seemed harmless. The children were given small doses of the old blood, an attempt to see if their bodies could handle the essence of the Great Ones. The choir believed that by exposing the children to this blood, they could unlock a higher form of existence, one that would allow them to transcend the physical and gain insight into the cosmic realms. They believed the children's innocence made them ideal subjects for such transformations, an attempt to bypass the madness and degeneration that had overtaken the adults who had received the blood before them. However, the experiments quickly became more extreme. The children, who were already in a fragile state of mind and body, were subjected to increasingly dangerous procedures. They were exposed to large amounts of blood, and the choir used them as vessels for communion with the Great Ones, forcing their young minds to experience visions of cosmic truths beyond their comprehension. The results were disastrous. Most of the children died, their bodies twisted and broken by the unnatural forces they were subjected to. Those who survived, however, were not spared. Instead of ascending to higher planes, as the choir had hoped, the surviving children became something else entirely. They were transformed, not into beings of enlightenment, but into grotesque and inhuman forms. The choir had succeeded in their quest to transcend humanity, but the cost had been far more terrible than they could have imagined. These children, transformed into twisted celestial emissaries, were no longer human, but nor were they truly Great Ones. They existed in a state between worlds, caught in a horrible limbo, their minds fractured, and their bodies forever altered by the horrors they had been subjected to. The celestial emissaries, as they came to be known, were tall and gaunt, with pale, bulbous heads that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Their skin was thin and translucent, and their movements were unnaturally graceful. They possessed an otherworldly beauty, but it was a beauty born of tragedy and suffering. These beings, once innocent children, were now tools of the choir's misguided ambitions. They were both the choir's greatest achievement and their greatest failure. The choir, unable to reverse the damage they had done, chose to lock these celestial emissaries away, hidden in the deepest recesses of the upper cathedral ward. There the emissaries would live in solitude, their existence a reminder of the choir's failure. The choir, for all their ambition and intellectual pursuit, had failed to understand the true nature of the Great Ones. They had sought to transcend humanity without fully understanding the price that such transcendence demanded. But the choir's story doesn't end with their failure to create perfect cosmic beings. In their relentless pursuit of knowledge, the choir sought to gain further access to the Great Ones by engaging in darker and more forbidden practices. They delved deeper into communion with the Great Ones, seeking to unlock the secrets of the cosmos, but this only led them further down the path of madness. It was in the depths of the upper cathedral ward that the choir made their most significant and most terrible discovery: the corpse of Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos. Ebrietas, a great one who had been abandoned or left behind in the ancient depths of the Thumerian labyrinths, was unlike the other great ones the choir had communed with. She was passive, almost mournful, her presence imbued with a sadness that seemed to resonate with the choir's own tragic fate. The choir believed that by studying Ebrietas and communing with her, they could unlock the final secrets of ascension, the final step in their quest to transcend humanity. But the truth was far more horrifying. Ebrietas, though she seemed to offer her knowledge willingly, was not the benevolent entity the choir had hoped for. The more the choir studied her, the more they realized that the Great Ones, in their alien nature, cared little for the welfare of humanity. Ebrietas was not a guide to enlightenment, but a reminder of the cold, indifferent cosmos, a force beyond human understanding, one that did not care for the suffering of those who sought to commune with it. The choir, despite their intellectual prowess and spiritual dedication, had failed to comprehend the true nature of the Great Ones. They had sought to transcend humanity, but in doing so, they had lost their humanity entirely. The celestial emissaries, once children, now stood as a testament to the choir's failure, monstrous, tragic, and forever bound to the same curse that had claimed the city of Yharnam itself. The story of the hunters is one of servitude, of dreams and nightmares, and of a cycle that perpetuates itself across time. It is a tale of those who took up arms to protect the city of Yharnam from the beasts, only to be trapped in an unending loop of violence, death, and unrelenting torment. But at the center of this story is Yharnam, the first hunter, a man whose own ambition led him to become not only a hunter, but also a prisoner in the hunter's dream, a dreamscape that would forever keep him tethered to the horrors of the world he sought to destroy. Yharnam was once a man of ambition, a man who lived in a time before the scourge of beasts had fully taken hold of Yharnam. He was a man who saw the burgeoning threat of the beasts and made it his mission to protect the city from the spreading plague. Yharnam, unlike many of the other hunters who followed in his footsteps, had no desire for fame or glory. He simply believed in the need to protect those who could not protect themselves. But in his pursuit of that noble goal, Yharnam's fate would become intertwined with the very darkness he sought to extinguish. It was Gehrman who was chosen by the Healing Church to lead the first hunting party. He became the leader of the hunters, a small group of warriors tasked with fighting back the ever-growing hordes of beasts. But as the hunts continued, Gehrman's role began to change. The deeper the hunters delved into the nightmarish world of the beasts, the more they became like the very creatures they sought to destroy. The line between hunter and beast began to blur. The more Gehrman killed, the more he became consumed by the hunt. It was not long before Gehrman was approached by a being known as the Moon Presence. The Moon Presence was one of the Great Ones, a cosmic entity whose power and influence stretched far beyond the mortal realm. This Great One offered Gehrman a bargain to become the first of the hunters, to serve as the warden of the hunter's dream in exchange for immortality. The Moon Presence, in its inscrutable and alien way, offered Gehrman the chance to continue his work in a dreamlike state, where time had no meaning and death was but an illusion. Gehrman, unable to resist the allure of the offer, accepted the bargain. He was bound to the hunter's dream, an endless realm where the cycle of hunting and death would continue forever. There, Gehrman would serve as the caretaker, overseeing the hunters who would come after him. The dream, however, was no paradise. It was a place of torment and perpetual struggle. The hunters who entered the dream were trapped in a cycle of violence, forced to hunt the beasts without end, only to return to the dream once their mission was complete. Though Gehrman had sought to protect Yharnam, his decision to accept the Moon Presence's offer would come at a great cost. The curse of the dream bound him to an endless existence, and the weight of his actions began to take a toll on him. He had once been a noble protector, but over time he became something darker. His role as the caretaker of the dream was not one of peace, but of endless servitude. He became trapped in a prison of his own making, unable to escape the cycle of violence and death that defined the life of a hunter. But Gehrman's torment didn't end there. The Moon Presence, in its twisted sense of justice, did not only bind Gehrman to the dream, it also left him with a terrible burden, the creation of the doll. The doll was a manifestation of Gehrman's own desires, a figure who would serve as his companion in the dream. The doll was a beautiful ethereal being, created to be the caretaker's confidante, a symbol of the love and longing that still lingered within Gehrman's heart. The doll, however, was not just a creation of Gehrman's mind. She was a part of the dream itself, a being who existed to keep Gehrman company for eternity. She was the embodiment of his regret, of the guilt that he could never escape. In many ways, the doll represented the fractured remnants of Gehrman's lost humanity. Though she was a figure of comfort, she was also a reminder of the price Gehrman had paid for immortality. And, like all things in the dream, the doll was bound to the same tragic fate that awaited the hunters who came after her, trapped in an eternal cycle of death and rebirth. As time passed, more hunters arrived in the dream. They, too, became part of the cycle. They would hunt the beasts, only to return to the dream once their mission was complete. Some hunters, like Gehrman, began to lose themselves in the violence of their work, while others sought to break free from the cycle. But the dream offered no escape. The hunters were bound to it, just as Gehrman had been. For many, the dream became a nightmare, a place of torment and despair, where the line between hunter and beast became ever more difficult to discern. The hunters who came after Gehrman were no different from him in the end. They, too, became lost in the cycle, bound to the same unending struggle. The dream, which had once been a place of protection, had become a prison for both the hunters and the creatures they sought to destroy. As Gehrman grew older, he began to realize the full extent of his mistake. He had sought to protect Yharnam, to keep the beasts at bay, but in the process, He had sacrificed his own humanity. The dream had become his prison, and he was its eternal warden. The hunters who came after him were no better off. They too were bound by the same fate. Gehrman had once believed that he was protecting Yharnam, but now he saw the truth. Yharnam was lost, and so was he. In his final days, Gehrman began to question whether his work had ever been worth it. He had been given the power to transcend, to become something greater, but all he had found was emptiness. The dream had stripped him of his humanity, and he had lost everything in the process. His regret was overwhelming. He had hoped for peace, but he had found only endless torment. In the end, Gehrman made one final choice. He would no longer serve the moon presence. He would end the cycle once and for all. And so, in the final confrontation, the last of the hunters would face the first. Gehrman, now a shadow of the man he once was, would fight to free himself from the eternal dream that had held him captive for so long. The hunters of Yharnam, whether they knew it or not, were all bound to the same fate that had befallen Gehrman. The dream was not a place of solace, it was a prison. The hunters were trapped in a cycle of violence, driven by the blood they wielded, unable to escape the curse they had unknowingly accepted. Gehrman's dream was not a vision of peace, but a nightmare that would haunt him and the city of Yharnam forever. Far from the heart of Yharnam, in a secluded, mist-covered stretch of coast, there lay a village, an ancient fishing hamlet tucked away on the edge of the world. This was a place of simple folk who lived their lives in quiet isolation, their connection to the sea the center of their existence. The villagers of the fishing hamlet had long lived in harmony with the natural world, dependent on the sea for sustenance, their lives intertwined with the ebb and flow of the tides. But this seemingly peaceful life was disrupted by a tragedy of cosmic proportions, one that would reverberate through the city of Yharnam and shape the course of Bloodborne's dark lore. At the heart of this village lay a secret, one that had been buried deep beneath the ocean's surface. It was a secret so powerful that it would change everything for the people of the fishing hamlet. The villagers had long been aware of an ancient and cosmic presence that lay beneath the waves, a being of unimaginable power that the villagers had come to worship, the Great One. Kos was a celestial entity, one of the Great Ones, beings who existed beyond the mortal realm, outside the boundaries of time and space. Unlike the other Great Ones, Kos had chosen the sea as its domain, where it lived in relative peace. To the villagers, Kos was not a figure of terror, but one of reverence, a deity whose power they had learned to accept and respect. Kos was said to protect the villagers, guiding them through the turbulent waters and providing them with bountiful catches in exchange for their worship. The villagers lived in harmony with Kos for generations, knowing the unspoken rule of their pact, to honor the Great One in secret, not to disturb its slumber beneath the waves. The villagers paid their respects through rituals and offerings, keeping their knowledge of Kos hidden from outsiders, as was the custom. They had long accepted their place in the cosmic order, small, insignificant beings, mere caretakers of an ancient secret. But this fragile peace would soon be shattered by the greed and ambition of outsiders, the scholars and clerics of the healing church. The church, ever hungry for power and knowledge, had been seeking new ways to commune with the Great Ones, to unlock the secrets of the cosmos and harness the power of these entities. Their pursuit of transcendence had led them to the fishing hamlet, and they quickly discovered that the villagers were in communion with a Great One of unimaginable significance. The church, seeing an opportunity to further their own ambitions, approached the villagers, demanding to know more about their connection with Kos. But the villagers, bound by ancient vows, refused to share the secrets of their pact with outsiders. They knew that disturbing Kos, waking it from its slumber, would unleash unimaginable consequences, not only for the villagers, but for the entire world. They had kept their relationship with Kos a secret for so long because they understood the delicate balance between humanity and the cosmic beings that lay beyond. But the healing church, driven by its insatiable thirst for knowledge, could not be dissuaded. In their arrogance, the scholars of the healing church ignored the warnings of the villagers. They saw only power, and they believed that they could control Kos as they had tried to control the old blood. They sought to harness the Great One's power, to understand its nature, and to use it for their own purposes. The villagers, desperate to protect their sacred secret, resisted, but it was too late. The church had already begun its experiments, and Kos was disturbed from its ancient slumber. What followed was nothing short of a catastrophe. The intrusion upon Kos's domain unleashed a chain of horrors that the villagers were unprepared for. Kos, awakened and enraged by the desecration of its sanctum, retaliated with unrelenting fury. The once peaceful village was torn asunder as the Great One's power lashed out in every direction. The waters rose violently, drowning homes and livelihoods alike. The villagers who had once lived in harmony with the sea were now torn apart by the wrath of the Great One they had once revered. In their desperation, the healing church and the scholars sought to placate Kos, to make amends for their transgressions, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and Kos's wrath could not be contained. The villagers, once a proud and noble people, were reduced to nothing more than sacrifices to the Great One's anger. They were slaughtered in their own homes, their lives consumed by the very force they had once worshipped. But the Kos did not end with the death of the villagers. The church, in its madness, had unwittingly set in motion a chain of events that would haunt the entire world. The beasts that had once plagued Yharnam were nothing compared to the horrors that would emerge from the wreckage of the fishing hamlet. The blood of Kos, mingled with the blood of the villagers and the scholars, began to transform those who had been exposed to it. The Great One's power infected not only the people of the village, but also the very fabric of reality itself. The aftermath of this tragedy was not just a physical one. The fishing hamlet became a place of eternal grief, a reminder of the sin of the healing church. The villagers, who had once lived in relative peace, were now nothing more than twisted remnants of their former selves, monstrous, beastly figures who wandered the flooded ruins of their village. Those who had once been human were now transformed into something darker, cursed by the very blood that had been used to commune with Kos. The church, having caused this tragedy, sought to cover up its actions, hiding the evidence of its involvement in the disaster. The remains of the fishing hamlet were abandoned, its once thriving community now reduced to ruins. The truth of what had happened there was buried, swept beneath the waves along with the bodies of the villagers and the remains of the church's failed experiments. But the curse of the fishing hamlet was not so easily erased. The souls of those who had died there lingered, their spirits forever bound to the waters and the cosmic horrors that had been unleashed. The Great One, Kos, had not been placated by the church's actions. Instead, it had become an enduring symbol of humanity's hubris and the consequences of meddling with forces beyond understanding. The fishing hamlet, now lost to time and memory, stood as a monument to the dangers of seeking to control the Great Ones. The tragedy that unfolded there would forever haunt the healing church, a reminder that some secrets were never meant to be uncovered, and some pacts were never meant to be broken. And so, the village and its people were forgotten, their stories erased from history. The only evidence that remained of the calamity was the remains of the ruins, buried beneath the ocean waves, and the whispers of those who had witnessed the horrors of the fishing hamlet, lost to the sands of time. Far from the streets of Yharnam, nestled high in the mountains, Canehurst Castle stood as a symbol of aristocratic power and secrecy. It was a place of grandeur, bathed in eternal twilight, its towering spires reaching toward a sky perpetually shrouded in mist. The castle was home to the Vile Bloods, a faction of noble families who had long lived outside the reach of the healing church. Hidden away in their secluded fortress, the Vile Bloods were not like the ordinary citizens of Yharnam, nor were they like the fanatical clergy who ran the healing church. They were aristocrats obsessed with power, and they sought transcendence through an entirely different means, one far darker than even the blood rituals of the church. At the heart of Canehurst's nobility was Queen Annalise, the sovereign ruler of the Vile Bloods, beautiful, regal, and commanding. Annalise led her people with a vision that transcended the ambitions of the common Yharnamites. She believed that true power came not from the crude blood ministrations of the church, but from the ancient, forbidden rites passed down through the Vile Blood lineage. The Vile Bloods, unlike the healing church, had discovered their own way of using blood to achieve their goals, through the pursuit of immortality and power, using the very blood of the Great Ones. The Vile Bloods had a long and twisted history with the Great Ones, and their understanding of blood was vastly different from that of the church. While the church had pursued blood to cure ailments and transform humanity, the Vile Bloods had used it to prolong life and enhance their physical and spiritual power. They viewed the Great Ones as a means of achieving eternal life, a power that would allow them to transcend the mortal world and achieve immortality. For centuries they had practiced their dark rituals, keeping their secrets hidden from the prying eyes of the healing church and the people of Yharnam. But immortality, as they would soon learn, comes with a price. The Vile Bloods had long been engaged in a bitter rivalry with the healing church, who saw their practices as sacrilegious and dangerous. The church's leaders, especially those like Father Gascoigne, saw the Vile Bloods as a threat to the purity of their own beliefs and practices. They viewed them as heretics, wielding blood in ways that went against the teachings of the church. The Vile Bloods, in turn, resented the church for their pretensions of moral superiority and for their attempts to control the use of blood for their own ends. This rivalry came to a head when the healing church, in their obsessive pursuit of knowledge, discovered the true nature of the Vile Bloods' practices. They learned that the Vile Bloods had been using a special type of blood, one derived from the ancient Great Ones, to fuel their immortality. The blood they had been using was not just a life-extending substance. It was the blood of the Great Ones themselves, potent with cosmic power and fraught with untold dangers. This knowledge sent shockwaves through the healing church, and the decision was made that the Vile Bloods had to be eradicated. In response, the Vile Bloods retreated further into the shadows, hiding in the recesses of Canehurst Castle, but they did not go down without a fight. The Vile Bloods were not simply aristocrats. They were warriors, skilled in the dark arts of blood manipulation. They had long honed their craft, and they would not relinquish their power without a bloody confrontation. It was during this time of conflict that the church, in a bid to eliminate the Vile Bloods once and for all, sent their hunters to Canehurst Castle. The hunters, equipped with the finest weapons and armor, stormed the castle in a desperate attempt to root out the heretical blood rituals and put an end to the Vile Bloods' reign. But the hunters were not prepared for what awaited them. The Vile Bloods had long since made pacts with the ancient powers of the Great Ones. They had sacrificed many of their own people to harness the blood's power, and they had become far more than just mortal aristocrats. The Vile Bloods had transformed themselves into something more, beings who were part human, part celestial, their bodies imbued with the power of the Great Ones. They were the true rulers of Cainhurst Castle, their power unchallenged by the hunters sent to destroy them. As the hunters pressed further into Cainhurst, they began to realize the full extent of the power the Vile Bloods had gained. The castle itself seemed to shift and change, its halls twisting and bending in impossible ways. The Vile Bloods had become something beyond human comprehension, and the hunters found themselves caught in a battle they could not hope to win. The Vile Bloods, with their dark magic and superior strength, tore through the hunters with ease. The battle was fierce, but it was clear from the start that the hunters had no chance against the ancient power of the Vile Bloods. The conflict culminated in a tragic final confrontation between the Vile Bloods and the Healing Church's hunters. The hunters, once proud and confident in their abilities, were wiped out by the blood-imbued warriors of Cainhurst. Queen Annalise, who had once been the beacon of the Vile Bloods' power, was captured by the hunters. However, her fate was far from a simple death. She was trapped within the castle, her body placed in a deep slumber, unable to escape the horrors that would follow. The fall of the Vile Bloods marked the end of an era. With Queen Annalise defeated and the Vile Bloods scattered and broken, the Healing Church had won the war. Cainhurst Castle was abandoned, and its once proud inhabitants were left to rot in the ruins. But the price of this victory was steep. The blood of the Vile Bloods was not easily eradicated, and it lingered, festering in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface. In the years that followed, the Vile Bloods became a forgotten tale, their name lost to the annals of history. The Healing Church, in their victory, sought to bury the legacy of the Vile Bloods, to erase the memory of their existence. But the blood of the Great Ones is not so easily forgotten. The curse of Cainhurst Castle would continue to haunt the world, even as the Healing Church sought to maintain its control. As the years passed, the city of Yharnam moved on, its people forgetting the horrors of Cainhurst Castle and the rise and fall of the Vile Bloods. But deep within the ruins of the castle, the echoes of the Vile Bloods' dark rituals could still be heard. The blood of the Great Ones, though hidden away, had not been eradicated. The curse of Cainhurst Castle would remain, a silent reminder of the dangers of seeking power beyond human understanding. The Vile Bloods may have fallen, but their legacy lived on in the blood that had once granted them immortality. The city of Yharnam, unaware of the ancient powers lurking in the shadows, would soon come face to face with the consequences of their ambitions. The cycle of blood, death, and ambition would continue, for there were always those who sought to transcend humanity, no matter the cost. The beast scourge, which had begun as a whisper in the shadows of Yharnam, was now an undeniable force. What had started as isolated cases of strange transformations, subtle shifts in human nature, had spiraled into an uncontrollable epidemic. The streets were crawling with beasts, creatures that had once been human, twisted by the old blood into something monstrous. Their minds shattered, their bodies contorted into unnatural forms. They were now roaming the city's districts, feeding on the very citizens they had once been. Yet the Healing Church, which had long preached the promise of salvation through blood, denied the truth of what was unfolding in their city. The church had long been at the center of Yharnam's healing practices, its ministers performing miracles through the blood of the Great Ones. When the first cases of transformation began to appear, when the first signs of the beast scourge made their way through the city, the church chose to deny the obvious. Their leaders, too obsessed with the pursuit of transcendence and power, refused to admit that the old blood, the very substance they had revered, was the source of the scourge. They blamed the outbreak on an external plague, a curse that had befallen Yharnam, masking the truth of their own creation. This deception was not just a failure of leadership, it was a failure of responsibility. The healing church had long used the old blood to heal the sick, to cure ailments, and to grant power to those who sought it. But in their relentless quest for knowledge and strength, they had neglected the dangers that came with the blood. The blood that had once been used as a remedy had transformed, its side effects becoming increasingly apparent. Those who received it began to change, not immediately, but slowly over time. It was a transformation that could not be seen at first, but by the time the church realized what was happening, it was far too late. The blood didn't just heal, it corrupted. It twisted the mind, drove the victim mad, and turned their bodies into grotesque mockeries of life. At first, the afflicted were easy to hide. They were simply locked away in quarantine or isolated in remote parts of the city. But as the number of infected grew, so did the beasts. And the people, already fearful of the mysterious transformation, began to panic. The streets were no longer safe. The beast scourge had spread too far, and the church, rather than offering salvation, had become the creator of the very nightmare the city now faced. Instead of confronting the reality of the situation, the church doubled down on its deception. They spun stories of a mystical plague that had infected the population, blaming the transformation of the people on an ancient curse, a curse that they would promise to lift through the right prayers, the right rituals, and of course, the right blood. It was a lie, but a lie that kept the church in control. A lie that gave them the power to direct the masses into a false sense of security. The beast scourge, after all, was not their fault. It was something beyond their control, a tragedy that had fallen upon them. Or so they said. The church's manipulation didn't stop there. In their attempt to keep the people from realizing the truth, they made the hunters their enforcers. The hunters were tasked with protecting the city from the beasts, of course, but their true mission was far darker. The hunters were not only tasked with slaying the beasts, they were tasked with keeping the populace in check, with preventing them from realizing that the very blood they sought to control was the cause of their suffering. In time, the hunters became nothing more than pawns in the church's greater game. The church had no intention of ending the hunt. They wanted to perpetuate it. They wanted the beasts to exist, because without them, the church would lose its grip on power. The hunt was a symbol of their dominance, their control over the populace. They could use the fear of the beasts to manipulate the people, to make them believe that only the church and its hunters could protect them from the horrors lurking in the streets. But as the years passed, the people of Yharnam began to see through the church's lies. There were whispers, rumors that spread through the city, growing louder as the beast scourge reached its peak. The people began to question the church's role in the outbreak. If the church had caused the scourge, why did they continue to administer the blood? Why did they not stop the practice? Why, when the city was in peril, did they continue their dangerous experiments? The truth was undeniable. This was not a plague from outside forces. It was a plague that had been created from within, from the very blood the church had championed. The truth, however, was buried beneath layers of deception. The church had too much power, and the people, though suspicious, were too afraid to challenge the institution that controlled their lives. The church's control over the city's healing practices and the hunt ensured that its lies would remain hidden for as long as possible. But even as the truth seemed to fade into the shadows, the evidence was there. waiting to be uncovered by those brave enough to seek it. For those who sought the truth, the way forward was clear. The old blood had to be eradicated. But the question remained, how? How could one rid the city of a force that had become so deeply entrenched in its fabric? The blood, which had once been hailed as the cure for all ailments, had now become the source of the city's greatest suffering. And it was clear that no one, not even the healing church, could undo the damage they had done. The beast scourge was not just a biological phenomenon. It was a symbol of the moral decay that had taken root within the church. The church had become so obsessed with the power of the blood, with the pursuit of transcendence, that they had lost sight of their original purpose, to protect the people. They had created a world in which violence, fear, and suffering were justified in the name of progress, and they had done so by sacrificing the very people they had sworn to protect. In the end, the beast scourge was not just the result of the church's blood experiments. It was the result of their lies, their hubris, and their refusal to admit the truth. The church had created a society where the pursuit of power, no matter the cost, was more important than the well-being of the people. They had twisted their original mission, perverted their faith, and sacrificed the people of Yharnam to the blood. The beasts that now roamed the streets were the inevitable consequence of this moral corruption. A reminder that when humanity seeks power at any cost, it loses its soul. The deception of the healing church would never be fully realized by the people. For as long as they feared the beasts, they would continue to trust the church's word. But the truth was there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for those brave enough to uncover it. And as the city of Yharnam continued to burn, the church's grip on power remained intact, its lies woven into the very fabric of the city itself. The curse of the hunter's nightmare is where the true horror of Bloodborne is laid bare. After death, the hunters do not find peace or escape from their torment. Instead, they are bound to a place far more horrific, an endless liminal space where the line between life and death is blurred. This is the true nature of the hunter's dream, a place where time holds no meaning, and the cycle of violence, death, and rebirth repeats itself endlessly. What was once a sanctuary, a space where hunters could rest between their hunts, becomes a prison from which there is no escape. In this twisted realm, the dead do not rest. The spirits of those who once sought to protect Yharnam and its people, now forever trapped in their duties, endure a cycle of suffering that never ceases. For the hunters, the nightmare is inescapable. The cycle that begins with death continues with the promise of new hunts, new battles against beasts, only to return to the nightmare once their mission is completed. The hunters are bound to this existence, doomed to repeat the same actions over and over again, their efforts ultimately futile. At the center of this horrific cycle stands Yharnam, the first hunter, the man who was chosen to lead the hunt and ultimately the one who would become trapped in this cycle of torment. Yharnam, once a noble man, a protector of Yharnam, had long since lost his humanity. His name, now a symbol of sacrifice, is tied to the fate of every hunter who follows him. He was the one who accepted the offer made by the moon presence, the great one who gave him immortality and the power to continue the hunt. But immortality, as Yharnam would soon learn, is a curse, a never-ending spiral that would bind him to a fate worse than death. The moon presence, in its cryptic and unknowable way, had offered Yharnam a chance to transcend the limitations of mortality. But what it truly offered him was not transcendence, but an eternal prison. Yharnam was not given the power to break free from the curse of the hunt. He was instead forced to guide the new hunters, to shepherd them through their own fates of endless violence and suffering. He could never rest. He could never escape. He was bound to the hunter's dream, a place of perpetual torment, where the horrors of the hunt would never cease. The dream, which had initially seemed like a place of refuge, had become a place of eternal suffering. Gehrman's existence in the hunter's dream was not just that of a guide. It was one of painful self-awareness. He knew the futility of the hunts, the endless cycle of life and death that awaited every hunter who entered the dream. The hunters, trapped in this liminal space, were all doomed to repeat the same actions. No matter how many beasts they killed, no matter how many victories they won, they could never escape the nightmare. The dream offered them no peace, no solace. It was merely a waiting room for their next hunt, an endless cycle that would never end. At Gehrman's side in the hunter's dream is the doll, a figure created to accompany him in his eternal torment. The doll is a beautiful, ethereal being, a reflection of Gehrman's lost humanity, and a reminder of the life he once had. She was not created by the Great Ones. She was created by Yharnam himself, born out of his need for companionship in the face of his eternal loneliness. The doll serves as both a comfort and a burden, a reminder of what Yharnam had once been and what he could never return to. She is the embodiment of all that he has lost, his humanity, his love, and his hope for freedom. The doll is bound to Gehrman's fate. She exists to keep him company, to soothe his tormented soul as he watches over the hunters who pass through the dream. But she too is trapped in the same cycle. Her existence, though filled with grace and beauty, is forever tied to the cycle of suffering that defines the hunter's dream. She is the quiet witness to Gehrman's torment, a symbol of the love he can never have and the life he can never return to. The doll's presence in the hunter's dream is not without meaning. She represents the human side of Yharnam, the part of him that once had hope, that once sought peace. But it is also a tragic reminder of the cost of the curse. The doll, much like the hunters, is trapped in the nightmare. She cannot escape. No matter how much she may long for release, she can never leave Yharnam, for he cannot leave the dream. Together, they are bound to the cycle, forced to repeat their roles in an eternal dance of torment. The hunter's dream, despite its serene exterior, is a place of profound suffering. It is a place where the boundary between life and death has been broken, where the soul is caught in a web of endless repetition. The hunters, though they fight for survival, are never truly alive. They are trapped in a state of eternal struggle, forever bound to a cause that is ultimately meaningless. The dream offers them no answers, no way to escape. It is a place where they are forced to confront their own futility, to face the endless cycle of death and rebirth that defines their existence. Yharnam, the first hunter, is the ultimate tragic figure. He sought to protect Yharnam, to safeguard its people from the beasts, but in doing so, he condemned himself to an eternity of suffering. He is bound to the hunter's dream, forced to guide new hunters into the same fate. He can never rest, never find peace. His existence is a mirror of the fate that awaits all who become hunters, an endless cycle of violence, death, and torment. And yet even in his suffering, Yharnam continues to fulfill his role. He guides the hunters who come after him, imparting the knowledge of the hunt, teaching them the skills they need to survive. But he does so with a heavy heart, knowing that their fate is already sealed. They too will be trapped in the cycle, bound to the dream just as he is. No matter how many beasts they kill, no matter how many victories they achieve, they will never escape the nightmare. As Yharnam approaches his final moments, he begins to realize the true cost of the curse. The hunt was never about saving Yharnam. It was about maintaining the cycle. The hunters are not the saviors of the city. They are the instruments of its destruction. Gehrman's death, and the deaths of countless hunters before him, are merely part of the larger, tragic cycle that will continue for eternity. The hunter's nightmare is not just a place. It is a symbol of humanity's eternal struggle against forces beyond its understanding. A reminder that no matter how hard one fights, the cycle will never end. As the Bloodborne saga reaches its grim conclusion, the veil that once shrouded the mysteries of the hunter's dream is finally lifted. The hunter, having journeyed through the endless night, confronts the final revelation, a truth so profound, so deeply entwined with the very fabric of existence, that it changes everything they thought they knew. The Great Ones, those ancient and incomprehensible cosmic beings, are not the benevolent gods humanity had hoped for. They do not exist for the betterment of mankind, nor do they care for the suffering or the sacrifices of the hunters. The Great Ones, in their inscrutable way, exist for their own purposes, purposes far beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. They do not seek to uplift humanity. Rather, they use the hunters, the city of Yharnam, and the very blood that courses through its veins to fulfill goals that are entirely unknowable to humans. The hunters, who have been at the center of this war between beast and man, find themselves unwitting pawns in a cosmic game, their lives and deaths nothing more than part of an eternal cycle. The hunt, as it turns out, is not a noble cause or a means of protecting Yharnam. It is a self-perpetuating machine, a never-ending loop of violence, suffering, and rebirth. The hunters fight not for a noble purpose, but because they are bound to do so, trapped in the nightmare by the very beings they sought to serve. They are tools, nothing more, instruments of a greater, unknowable will that pushes them ever forward into an abyss from which there is no escape. The hunter's dream, which at first seemed like a sanctuary, a place for hunters to rest between their hunts, is revealed to be nothing more than a prison. This dream is not a restful escape from the horrors of the waking world. It is a liminal space where time holds no meaning, and the cycle of violence repeats itself with no end. In the dream, the hunter is forced to endure eternal servitude, guided by Gehrman, the first hunter, whose fate is as tragic as the dream itself. Gehrman, bound to the dream as both its warden and its prisoner, becomes the figurehead of this endless torment. His role is to guide new hunters into the same cycle, to perpetuate the hunt without ever questioning its purpose. As the hunter progresses through the dream, they are led to believe that they are fighting for a cause, that they are protecting Yharnam, ridding the world of the beasts that plague it. But the truth is far darker. The beasts are not merely creatures to be eradicated. They are victims, just as much a product of the Great One's manipulation as the hunters themselves. The blood that gives the hunters their strength and power is the same blood that turns people into beasts. The Great Ones, in their pursuit of their own inscrutable goals, have used the blood as a tool to shape the world, to create and destroy, to manipulate human lives in ways that are impossible to comprehend. As the good hunter confronts Gehrman in the heart of the dream, the final revelation comes to light. The good hunter learns that their fate was never truly their own. They are not a hero in a story of redemption. They are merely another victim in an endless cycle of torment. The cycle of the hunt is not one that can be broken, not one that can be escaped. It is a loop that stretches back to the very origins of the hunter's dream, a loop that will continue indefinitely. The good hunter, though they may have slain beasts and fought the horrors that plague the world, will never be free of the curse. Their actions, their struggles, are just another part of the larger cosmic plan that stretches far beyond their understanding. The moon presence, a great one that has watched over the hunter's dream, reveals itself to the good hunter at the end of the cycle. This entity, once a distant and cryptic force, becomes the ultimate symbol of the fate that awaits all who enter the dream. The moon presence offers the good hunter a choice: to become part of the dream, to take Yharnam's place as the warden of the hunters, or to remain in the cycle forever bound to the nightmare. It is an offer that carries with it a deep, terrible cost. To accept the moon presence's offer is to join the ranks of those who are trapped in this cosmic prison, to become yet another prisoner in the endless cycle of death and rebirth. The good hunter's choice, ultimately, is one of sacrifice. No matter what decision they make, they are trapped in the same cycle. If they choose to become the new caretaker of the dream, they are doomed to guide future hunters, to serve the will of the Great Ones, to ensure that the hunt continues without end. If they reject the offer, they will be left to face the same fate as Yharnam, to live out the rest of their existence in a state of eternal torment, never truly free, forever bound to the nightmare that was created by the Great Ones. In the end, the tragedy of Bloodborne is not just the story of the beasts, the church, or the hunters. It is the story of humanity's unrelenting desire to transcend its limitations, no matter the cost. The price of seeking the old blood, of communing with the Great Ones, is madness, transformation, and ultimately the destruction of everything that made humanity human. The Great Ones, in their alien nature, care nothing for the desires or suffering of mortals. They manipulate humanity's ambitions, using the hunters and the people of Yharnam as pawns in a game they cannot hope to understand. The dream, once believed to be a gift, is nothing more than a curse, a trap set by forces beyond comprehension, a cycle of suffering that will never end. The good hunter, like all the others before them, is doomed to repeat this cycle forever. The hunt will continue, endlessly, and the hunters will never be free. The true horror of Bloodborne is not the beasts that roam the streets of Yharnam, but the realization that the hunter's fate was never truly their own. The hunt is not a fight for survival. It is an endless, self-perpetuating cycle that no one can escape. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the haunting world of Bloodborne. The cycle of the hunt may never truly end, and the blood, the beasts, and the curses that bind Yharnam's citizens will linger long after the echoes of our tale fade into silence. As the moon sets on the hunter's dream, we are reminded that even in the darkest corners of this cursed world, the stories of those who dare to seek transcendence, to challenge their fate, and to fight against the forces beyond human comprehension, will never be forgotten. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Bloodborne's twisted lore. If these stories of madness, sacrifice, and unrelenting ambition have stirred something within you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please like, subscribe, and share your favorite parts of the tale. What moment or character haunted you the most? Your feedback guides these stories, and your participation helps bring them to life. Rest well, for even in sleep, the echoes of the hunt remain. Until we meet again, remember, some dreams are best left undisturbed.